You are listening to Latinx America, a podcast focused on highlighting catalysts who are using, leveraging, or creating technology to help our community achieve more. With your host, Adriana Flores Ragade. Today's guest is Maria Salamanca. She is a venture capitalist at Unshackled Ventures. She's an activist, leader, and advisor at Swing Left, a fellow at Higher Ground Labs, and a founder at Making a Techie newsletter. Unshackled Ventures is a fund that fills a unique space in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, funding teams with immigrant founders at the earliest stage of pre-seed. Since joining the fund 3 years ago, Maria has involved in all 22 investments and has evaluated more than 2,500 deals. Maria is not only a leader, but a key figure in the pre-seed investment community, supporting underrepresented founders just like herself. In 2018, she was the first Latina named Forbes 30 Under 30 for venture capital and Business Insider's new 30 Rising Stars. She's deeply involved in supporting the Latino entrepreneurship ecosystem, including being on the committee for the first ever Startup Weekend Latinx Tech Edition and creating the first list and group of Latinas in venture capital. It is this strong support and investment in her community that won her the 2017 California Hispanic Chamber of Commerce Shark of the Year Award. Previous to joining Unshackled, Maria worked at Forward US, an immigration-loving group founded by Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Ron Conway, Reid Hoffman, and other tech leaders. She immigrated to Orlando, Florida from Colombia at age 7. She attended UC Berkeley and received a double bachelor's degree in public policy and legal studies. She is a mentor at Year Up, IDEO, Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative, and Founders Institute. Maria, thanks for being with us today. Can you start by sharing a bit about your personal journey into tech and venture capital?
Yeah, so I'll start kind of with when I was very young, obviously. So I was born in Bogota, Colombia. My parents left Bogota in the 90s when, everything wasn't ideal back in the country. I was 7 years old. We moved to Florida. Neither of my parents have a college degree, so even though we lived a fairly comfortable life in Colombia, middle-class family, coming to the U.S. with no degree automatically kind of puts you into a bucket of opportunities that you have without having the language and without having the skills and without having the college degree. So both of my parents went to work blue-collar jobs. They used to work at rental cars, a lot of cleaning jobs. Now they work at the University of Central Florida, and all these really hard jobs, really tough jobs. And the one thing they really said was you have to do good at school. They're like, we have so many jobs, you have one job, and your job is school. And that always resonated with me and being like, you're right. Like, I don't contribute here. I'm not paying for food. I'm not paying for rent. And I think as a kid, sometimes for me, I was the kind of kid that liked to have projects. And when they were very clear, constantly saying your one job is to do school and do it right, because that's your one thing. And so, I loved school. I was fairly good at it. And I remember I actually wasn't thinking about college for a long time because I wasn't sure how to afford it. I had no clue how any of this worked, honestly. But I had really good mentors and teachers that really took a bet on me. And so I had a debate coach who I still love and keep in contact with, who kind of took me under, and debate is one of those skills that across really teach some of the most valuable skills that I still use today, whether it's public speaking, argument-based making decisions, all kinds of stuff. And she was very like, you have good grades, you should really focus on going to a good college. And I think one of the biggest things that a lot of Latinos really miss, and just low-income folks in general, is the fact that a lot of the top schools, if you have the grades, actually have very, very generous financial aid. And at the time, it took someone who was my teacher to tell me that, to say, don't worry about money, we can worry about that later, for me to be like, sure, why not? And so that's kind of why I thought about that. But at the time, the area that I actually loved was immigration, and I wanted to go into law. And I applied to a lot of schools that had really good law schools. And at the time, I don't know why, but I fell in love with California. And I think it was just like the beautiful view of California. And even though I lived in Florida, so I wanted to get to West. And I don't have a particular reason, honestly, of why I ended up. I know I definitely wanted to stay in somewhere that wasn't freezing cold, like the Northeast. And so I remember I was between like Berkeley, Vanderbilt, and Duke at the time. And I just loved California. So I was like, I'm going to go to California. And being in Berkeley in general, tech is a huge part of it. I would say Berkeley now is very active, similar to kind of how Stanford was maybe 10, 20 years ago. And what is happening there is really exciting. So it was hard to not be interested in tech while being there. So that's really how that journey of even caring about tech came from.
It all started when you moved out here.
Yeah.
You caught the bug like everyone else.
I caught the bug. I really did catch the bug. I think for me was, I remember having very specific things that I wanted to do for the world. And I remember, obviously we're immigrants, we were refugees at the time, so we filed for asylum. And I just remember, it was a nightmare dealing with lawyers and my parents going through all that. Many times, like, I was the only one that spoke English, really. I had to do so much of the help and supporting them. And I think even as a kid, it was overwhelming, but I also realized being older and already in high school, like, this is a particularly complicated issue. It doesn't need to be as complicated. There's a lot of work. And I remember being like, I want to help folks that don't have access or resources to information, to like knowledge in general about the system. And I think that applies to all kinds of individuals. And I, at the time, I was like, law was the way for me to do this. And that's why I was attracted to law. But when I went to Berkeley and I saw that tech was another way to help folks. And to a degree, I did a couple of internships with law firms and with a couple of politicians and worked in campaigns. And I actually grew very frustrated with it. It was very slow. I realized a lot of folks in politics are in it for their egos. And immigration in general, policy just takes a very long time. And I fell in love with, as cliche as it sounds, the idea that tech is very disruptive. And it just, things like an Airbnb or an Uber of the world, even the Limes and the Birds now, like, sometimes they ignore all law and they really just go for it. And I thought at some point that kind of boldness and move forward in any approach, I actually admired it. Because I think my whole life I was like hitting walls of you can't do this, or this is complicated, this is not easy, whether it's policy or immigration or education or, being low income, it's just constant walls. And so tech attracted me in that if I can figure a way to get into tech, I can learn this mentality and bring it to other things that I care about. And so that's kind of why I fell in love with it. And I was like, it's still the same end, just different means, I guess.
To your ideals, because you had some clear set goals that you wanted to achieve. One of the things that really intrigued me when I was looking at your profile is the focus that your current work has on immigrant funders. And can we talk a bit about Unshackled Ventures, what you're doing there, and also why is it so important to have that strategic focus on immigrant founders?
Yeah, so I was actually working at the time, Zuckerberg had just started Forward.us, which is an immigration lobbying group that focuses on both high-skilled and low-skilled immigrants. And I was working on the policy side, on the research side, and a lot on helping them fundraise. So going to a lot of tech CEOs and venture capitalists to explain to them why immigration mattered to tech. And it's actually really hard because, like I said, it's not, tech many times operates independently of law in DC and how things get done. And so sending that pitch wasn't necessarily easy, but I was very passionate about immigrants of high skilled, low skilled, all over. And I saw an opportunity to get folks to care about all immigrants if we could have some self-interest in it. And at the time, this fund was just getting started, and my boss knew the two partners. And the fund was going to be, we are going to invest in teams, startups that have at least one immigrant foreign-born founder. And the idea behind it was that immigrants start businesses at 2 times the rate than natives. It's like 50% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by an immigrant. What they call today in tech the unicorns, or companies worth more than $1 billion in tech, it's like 40 to 50% of them are actually founded by an immigrant as well. I mean, the Elon Musks of the world, the WhatsApps of the world, Google. The founding team of a majority of the companies that we see today are actually by a foreign-born immigrant, and so in general, I think I gravitated towards it a lot because it's about changing the narrative of what an immigrant looks like. And we all know immigrants are hardworking regardless. And there are things that in tech, tech right now gets a lot of attention, both good and bad, but it definitely gets attention, and putting more emphasis on how do we create wealth, generational wealth. How do we change the narrative about what an immigrant does, what they do, and what value they bring was really important. So that's kind of what the fund focuses on.
When we often hear, and I like the change in narrative because we often hear all the bad things that immigrants do, but we never focus on the wonderful things that when we come together as a community, we can do to contribute to society, to contribute to this wonderful country that we all live in right now. The other question that I have is in regards to raising a VC. And I know we talked about how important immigration is to you personally, and you being a leader in terms of advocating for a while. Let's shift and talk a bit about venture capital. We've interviewed guests who have been either raising a VC or currently working in VCs and have just learned a great deal from them. How successful do you think Latinx have been in building an ecosystem in your field? And in your opinion, what do you see working and what needs change?
It definitely takes time. I mean, there are so many barriers into getting to VC, right? I mean, I think it's like 60% of venture capitalists went to Harvard or Stanford, undergrad and grad. So that by itself already limits the pool of folks that can get in. On top of being, a Stanford, Harvard graduate, majority of VCs come from operational backgrounds at high growth startups. So that means that they were first 200 or so employees at the Airbnbs of the world, the Ubers of the world, the Facebooks of the world. And many of the times these roles tend to be product management, engineering roles, or business development. And by itself, just the technical, like having a Harvard and Stanford filter, and then on top of that, having a startup filter. And, as you might know, getting into startups early stages requires having a network because at that point, there's no really formal hiring process. They're hiring from their networks. Mostly if you have founders that went to Stanford and then Y Combinator, they're going to hire a bunch of their friends. And so that's just like a filter on top of a filter on top of a filter. And we are still catching up. I mean, I actually keep track of Latinas in venture capital, and I have a public list that every time someone tells me I found someone, I contact them, kind of find out if they are actually distributing capital. And we have 28 in the country in investor roles and venture capital, right? There's a lot more Latinos in like a private equity or iBanking, which is so different. In terms of venture capital of Latinas, so women, Latinas that are distributing capital to startups across all kinds of investment stages, there's 28 in the entire country. I mean, that's, it's an industry that is, I don't remember what was the last number. I want to say is how big venture capital industry as a whole is. But I mean, it's trillions of dollars, the amount of money that the assets under management. And for a couple folks to be able to get in helps, but we need folks at decision-making power, so being able to decide what companies to invest in, and having good access to capital. So, as a community, there's few at the investors, there's few at the tech roles, there's few at these universities. So it really, every single number counts. And it takes time to get everyone to align on we should really support each other, help each other, and everyone here having that presence is important. So there's definitely a lot of work to do, but it's happening. It's just slowly because it's many generational barriers.
With 28 or so, have you been able to like build a network? Do you share stories, good and bad stories, any best practices?
Yeah, there's a couple of groups. So there's a group that is women of color in venture capital, and it's actually a mix of African American, Asian, Latina women. The group that we have is the Latinas in Venture, and we're actually scattered all over the country. So there's Chicago, New York, LA, Boston, and a couple of Bay Area ones. And I think we all know of each other and definitely talk to each other, emails and companies to each other, which is really important, and make introductions. So we have expanded our network, but we don't see each other probably as often as we would like. And that's the hard part, right? When you're in Silicon Valley, every interaction matters, everyone knowing each other, kids going to school with each other, like that's what builds this ecosystem. It's why Silicon Valley is what it is. But we do a lot in supporting each other. We definitely, even across the country, we will send each other companies and ideas and thoughts and questions.
That's great in terms of building that important ecosystem. Can you share some success stories of Latinx or immigrant-led companies that you have been able to fund? And also, what kind of impact are they having through tech innovation? And then also maybe a bit about your process of how you go about funding them too. So if someone is listening and they have this great idea and they want to get it off the ground.
Yeah, of course. So because our focus is in expanding access and not just that, but expanding the pool of folks that are entrepreneurs, we have an actual open form on our website that anyone can submit. And every form gets looked at by at least 2 people on our 4-people team. And usually I'm one of them always because, the partners have a much busier schedule than I do. But so that by itself, one of the things that we promise as a fund is we will at least have 2 investment members of our team take a look at your idea, at your deck. And it doesn't matter if you come through an introduction or you just come through the form, everyone gets the same pair of eyes. And we hope that this evens out that equal playing field per se. And after that, we usually have a pitch. We come in, we have a 20-minute type of short pitch where we learn about the business and mostly get to understand how the founders are, how they behave, how they're thinking about it. If we still like it, we spend 4 to 6 other meetings one-on-one with the team, getting to know every part of the business, every part of the team. And we invest really early. I think this is actually what I love. We invest pre-product. So if you just have an idea and you've talked to a ton of customers and you know that this is something that's wanted, but most of the companies we invest in are pre-product, pre-revenue, of course. And after that, we usually do anywhere between 150 to 300K investment in the company. And we make about 10 investments or so a year. And we see, obviously a lot of companies, but it's definitely an exciting space to be in the early stages. I think this is where we can make a difference of folks that are choosing to be an entrepreneur or not. They might have an idea, done some research, but taking that leap without having money behind is actually where a lot of, I would say maybe our community probably drops out because it's expensive. It's definitely a privilege to be able to be an entrepreneur and take time off.
Take time off, bootstrap.
Yeah.
Because some people have the ability to bootstrap on their own, but sometimes if you're supporting a family, it's not a luxury that you can just take time off and run with your idea. Any success stories that you want to share with us that you've seen that are just doing really cool things or
Yeah,
making society a better place through what they're doing?
Yeah, a while back, we actually invested in a Peruvian. She was starting a company around travel and focusing on an app that allowed folks to have more social type of traveling and allowing people to make money from their experience in traveling. So having, that one person you always ask, like, where should I go to when I go to this place? And figuring that out. And so we actually invested in her as an entrepreneur in residence. And she's still working on this. And we're pretty excited. As an entrepreneur in residence, you're definitely earlier than starting the company. You don't have a team yet. You're still thinking through it. So But she's definitely someone we keep an eye on. She's an amazing, also Peruvian. She went to Harvard Business School, work at PG&E, like work at just really, really strong girl founder. And in general, what we find is there's just so many of these teams, right? It's not like they're all Latino teams. All these teams are hybrid. I mean, there's an American, there's Latino, there's African American. Sometimes, yeah, there are only one place, but I think that's the interesting thing, right? It's not like Elon Musk built Tesla or space by himself or only with people from his country, but it's just about that combination of teams that are immigrant and non-immigrant that really create a powerful, innovative team, and that's what's valuable.
I actually think I met her at TechCrunch yesterday because she was talking about travel, and I think she's going to Y Combinator.
Maybe, yeah. I think she's in town, so maybe because I'm not sure she went to TechCrunch honestly, but yeah, I believe it. I can't. We have like 20 something companies, so I cannot keep track of where everyone is. Absolutely.
In terms of Y Combinator, multiple guests have mentioned, Y Combinator. Can you talk a bit about what it is and what people thinking about, launching their venture, whether they're in the first phase or the second phase of their company? What is it and how does it benefit entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I mean, Y Combinator is kind of an accelerator program. And so the idea is that they also invest fairly early. I think at this point they choose about 100 companies per batch twice a year. And they work, I believe it's an 8-week program. And they work very closely one-on-one with the teams they basically say pick one metric, whether it's amount of customers, amount of sales, amount of revenue, like one metric that will define that you have found what we call product market fit. And from this metric, really focus on it in 8 weeks. Mm-hmm. And they're trained to do that really well. And after that, they basically let them do that metric for 8 weeks. And every single week, they just update them on that. And it's a great, successful program. And the way that it's structured, it creates a lot of urgency and a lot of support because there's 100 companies at the same time. So they're actually each other's customers all the time. In general, Y Combinator has amazing investors and who the partners there have built some of the best companies out there. So it's just a strong network of investors, founders in a very short period of time. That said, getting in requires you to already have a very keen focus, definitely have validated that the problem that you're trying to solve is a real problem, and have the right team. And by the right team means the relevant team for this problem. And so it's actually pretty tough to get into it, but there's a lot of benefits coming out of it. Although there's all kinds of funds now that invest probably at the same stages of Y Combinator. So, to teams out there that haven't gone into Y Combinator that need more support, there's a lot of what they call pre-seed funds, which is actually what we are, where we invest before Y Combinator or about at the same stage as Y Combinator.
So it's called a pre-seed fund.
Pre-seed, yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for enlightening me, because I know everyone mentions it, and I know, but there's someone out there that it's probably thinking, oh, they've said that 3 times during, multiple episodes.
Yeah, they also have open applications, so anyone can apply without having to get an introduction or anything. And I know a couple of, I'm Colombian, so I know there's 9 Colombian YC founders. In like the entire history of it, and they actually just had like a little reunion back in Bogota that I heard about last week. And I thought that was really cool. And slowly but surely we're getting more people through, and it's exciting.
And it seems, because I met some of them at one of the events that we attended together at the Impact Hub in San Francisco.
Garcia.
Yeah, not too long ago, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems that once someone makes it, they are coaching and helping others understand the process. So I think they are working on building a pipeline in that way, and they're changing the narrative for our community. Absolutely,
yeah. They're I mean, that team is 2 brothers. There's actually 3. Mm-hmm. One is in New York. 2 of them are here in the Bay Area, Colombian. But yeah, they have created this network of at least Colombians and Latinos that support each other through Y Combinator, tech, both in Latin America and here. And I think that's the interesting thing is that there's actually a lot of space to build tech solutions in Latin America. And Y Combinator has begun to fund companies that want to go back home. So, a lot of us are passionate about where we come from, and we're passionate about the topics that affect our community, whether that's in the US or back at home. And that doesn't stop investors from investing there. And a lot of Latinos have been able to break this kind of glass ceiling, per se, of getting into Y Combinator, and they are building a community to support each other.
So let's continue with the changing narrative conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen a lot of companies go through. You've heard a lot of pitches. You've read a lot of a lot of proposals. How can we help more Latinos become entrepreneurs or innovators? Because we're seen as consumers, and it's great because we're consuming. Our mobile consumption has increased, and we're at least using tech. But how can we move on to the roles of creators, investors, and change the social mobility for some in our community?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of investors, there's actually a good amount of Latinos out there that have enough money to become investors, even if it's as angel investors. To become an accredited investor, I think it's $200K, which is actually a lot of money. But I think in general, folks will invest in people like them. Mm-hmm. And we need more people that are distributing capital that look like us. So it's just when you invest in someone who just has an idea, it's a very trust-based relationship. And, science and psychology says we trust people like us. And so we need more folks to invest. That's super important. And high net worth individuals, both from Latin America and here in the US, to start giving back in that way. Mm-hmm. In terms of entrepreneurs, for changing that narrative, we need to highlight more of these stories, success stories around who is building really cool things for our community, or not for our community, but just being builders out there, and give kids and students those role models of saying this is absolutely a path that you can take. And I think in general, Latinos tend to be sometimes risk averse and, saying I'm not going to work for a year and focus on this idea. And I mean, my parents still today have a hard time understanding what I do as a job, which is just finding good companies and giving them money. And then they're like, where do you even get money to invest? And so I think that it's hard. There's some cultural barriers to understand. I mean, tech entrepreneurship has a lot of just big buzzwords. And I think we need to do better. We actually had a meeting recently with a lot of Latinos in tech. And one of our key takeaways from that meeting was we as Latinos in tech have to do a better job at translating tech to our community. Mm-hmm. Because it is a very insider versus outsider kind of language. A lot of the knowledge is insider knowledge on what product management is and engineering, and the kind of everything is very insider knowledge. Mm-hmm. And we need to do better at communicating this in a way that is accessible and less intimidating to our community. But I mean, it's just about how really changing that narrative. There's so many buzzwords that get used, and it's unless you live and breathe Silicon Valley, you hear all the time. Of course, you're going to be. I mean, folks that are white and very wealthy that are from anywhere out of Silicon Valley sometimes are like, I don't know what tech does or what any of this is. So it's how can we expect other individuals who come from different backgrounds to also get it?
So a couple of weeks ago when I interviewed Richie Serna, we were talking about the exact same thing. Yeah. As an entrepreneur, when he was taking some of the first meetings, he was catching up on what does this mean? He was doing a lot of learning, right, as he was launching his own.
Right.
So we decided to add a vocabulary word or term during each of the episodes.
Oh, nice.
So last week we started, so we provided a definition and an example of what that term means. We have to figure out, you and I have to figure out which term we're going to define later on.
Got it.
So we can add it to the episode.
I know I used unicorn before, but I said a unicorn is any company worth more than $1 billion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's
a unicorn startup. Yeah.
A unicorn startup. Let's talk a bit about your career. What advice would you give to someone listening right now in terms of career path? you came into it because you knew some of the founders, you had done some advocacy work, they knew what you were doing, but how could someone transition into what you're doing? And you also mentioned earlier that in terms of giving money, the number of Latinas in venture capital are 28. We have other Latinas probably in other roles that are not necessarily giving money, but how can we get more people in the type of position that you are, where you're actually evaluating and you're part of the decision-making process to fund someone?
Yeah.
And what advice would you wish someone had given you, like, a few years ago before you came into this industry?
Yeah, I mean, one of my really good friend from college used to have this saying, and it applies to all kinds of groups that come from underrepresented backgrounds or disadvantaged backgrounds. And there's the quote that says, you have to work twice as hard for half of what they have. And this applies into breaking into any industry. And so I would say the first thing is, whatever you want to do, build the skill sets. There's a lot of folks out there that might be like, okay, the biggest barrier is a network. And yes, a network is absolutely a barrier. But once you break through the network, you still have to have the skill set to do it. And so in the case of, someone who wants to break into venture capital, what is the everyday life of a venture capitalist? It is meeting with companies that they want to potentially invest in and supporting companies that they have invested in. And so if it's about, what is your value? What do you bring that's different from someone else if you were to do that job? Obviously, there's the basic skills. Excel is a must, strong communication skills, having a strong network of not just like rich, wealthy people, but other entrepreneurs, right? What does a company struggle with? They come to you and they're like, hey, we're trying to hire someone for this role. So my value as an investor is, how can I get them to fill that position? And so I have to have a strong network of folks in biz dev and engineering, and I have to be able to convince them to jump ship of whatever they're doing. So it's a broad network for a purpose. And second of all, like, what do I know about the business cycle and about what's going on in the entire landscape, right? If a company focusing on insurance tech comes to me with a problem around insurance tech, I better know what that landscape looks like. I better know what every company in that landscape is doing to be able to provide value for them. And so it's less so about how do I get into venture capital without the network, and more, how do I get into venture capital once I have earned all the skills and understanding and knowledge that I could possibly really bring to the table. And after that, it's really about, at the end of the day, we don't have access to that network. So cold emails is absolutely a thing. I mean, so many of the folks, my boss from when I worked at Forward.us, one of the first times I interacted with him was I sent him a cold email being like, I love what you're doing. I want to, like, how can I help? And me being like, I was a college student, so I was like, honestly, it's fine if you don't pay me, but I'll do it.
Isn't that how I met you too? I sent you a cold email.
Yeah, I mean, cold emails is a thing. And so a lot of it is going to be uncomfortable. A lot of it is going to be a lot of no's. A lot of it is going to be, you're going to feel constantly like you're working twice as hard. And the reality is that you are, but you have to. And you have to figure out a way to not be discouraged. And that goes for applying to college. That goes for applying to your first tech job. It goes for getting into venture capital. It requires a lot of work and skill building, and figuring out what the skills look like. It can be your first reaching out to people who are doing the job you want to do and saying, what skills do I realistically need before I even start looking into these type of jobs and connecting with everyone that does this type of job. And then after that, then focus on the network part of it.
And any advice that you wish you would have had like a few years ago?
Advice that I wish I would have had, let's see. I wish, yes, okay, one, mental health. As a Latina, obviously, I mean, a refugee, being a kid whose parents were always working. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we all deal with, we have to do it by ourselves. And we build a lot of walls around us. We build a lot of toughness around us, which helps us be successful, but at the same time, sometimes makes it hard for us to be vulnerable in times when it actually would be to our advantage. And so one of the things that I learned in the past 2 or so years, because everyone was talking about I go to a psychologist or I go to a psychiatrist, whatever it is. And, I grew up in a culture where if you go to a psychologist, you're crazy. Like only crazy people go there. And I remember being like, well, like everyone I work with goes to a psychologist, and I don't think any of them are crazy by the standards of my mother. So I was like, what do you talk about? And I started to kind of dive deeply into what is mental health and redefining trauma, right? When you think about trauma, you think of really bad things, like, really violent, like unfortunate upbringings. But the reality is a lot of trauma can be like something like neglect. And redefining neglect as being like, so maybe sometimes I would come home from school and I wouldn't see my parents for like 2 days because they were working 2 jobs and they weren't there to be there. They weren't there to feed me. Of course, I wouldn't say my parents were neglectful, but to a kid who isn't getting picked up at school, who's not getting fed at the time they're supposed to be fed, who has to figure out life on their own, that is what we would consider trauma. And I never saw it like that. I definitely don't think my parents did anything wrong by working hard to feed me. But I would say as a community, we need to do more around mental health and saying it's okay to go talk to people about your background or about your upbringing, about your community, about the struggles you face day to day. Because it takes a toll on us internally, emotionally, and it's good for us to be able to deal with it. And I wish that someone had told me that way earlier, rather than me have to like demystify for myself and feeling kind of weird about it.
It's a form of self-care.
It's a very big form.
Yeah. And I'm reading I'm taking a psych class, so that's Adler's theory in terms of neglect, because you're able to focus on resiliency. Like you develop, you're very resilient and you're highly motivated, but then there's the other side where until you come to terms with it later on in life, you can't get past it, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, congrats, you're super independent, but also it's like, when are you ever going to be dependent, or when are you going to trust people to take care of you? And that's hard for a lot of us. So I think, in general, I think demystifying mental health and psychology and thinking of something more as like an additional layer of things we have to work on is important.
Thank you. And thanks for your honesty, because not everybody, like I said, in our community is used to talking about mental health issues.
Yeah.
And I've been listening to a really good podcast called Latinx Therapy, and they talk about anxiety and they talk about
that's
other
awesome.
ways. Yeah, I'm gonna send you the link. Well, let's go back to your industry. If someone is interested in following certain people, influencers, or find resources online or any other type of resources, what would you recommend?
I think Twitter is actually a really, really great place. Twitter and LinkedIn, because a lot of folks in venture capital and tech who are thought leaders actually share most of their stuff in the form of a LinkedIn article, a Medium article, and most of them definitely tweet. And so I would say do a quick search around something you care about. So if it's about design and tech, right? User experience or user interface. Figure out like who are the top people in UX in Twitter. And go on there, make a profile, start following them. Because Twitter is less about you putting content out there, and it can be just a consumption of, like, you follow the people that you admire and you start reading what they're thinking. And that's kind of really helpful. And everyone, if you're, it's kind of one of those things like surround yourself with the best, smartest people. And it's like, if you can't do it physically, do it at least in your social media consumption. And Twitter's a great place to do that. And so that's why I go out there. My list of 28 Latinas in venture capital, I have next to in the column, aside from their name, what they do, where they're located, I have their Twitter URL. So anyone can just go on there and literally follow all of them. And we all talk about and send resources. We all care about our community. So, I don't know who I don't know. So many times I have to rely on social network being my only voice for reaching folks that I wouldn't reach otherwise or can't reach me. So things like Twitter and LinkedIn are actually really, really strong if you narrow down who to connect with and why you should connect with them.
Well, you should follow me, and I will follow you. I'm at America Latinx, and my 45 followers.
Okay, you'll have 46.
What is your Twitter handle again?
Maria Salamanca M.
Okay, so follow her and her tweets. Let's move on to some of our last questions.
Yeah.
Who has influenced you the most, either personally or professionally, or both, and why?
I I mean, definitely my parents. Honestly, it's cliche, but it really is my family. In general, I mean, they taught me the value of hard work, of sacrifice, and I think most of all of the underdog perspective, of saying it's yes, like accept if you're an underdog, own it, and like move past it. I think it's easy to get stuck in that. It's unfair. Everything is not where we want it to be. I don't have the best network. I don't have the best resources. I don't have the best amount of money. And that by itself, it's like that is what it is. And you have to figure a way to really push forward. And I think, there have been generations on top of generations of our community who have dealt with what they were handed with and made some serious progress for all of us. And we, if they're not around here, it's every generation gets their turn. And we're all going to have that turn, and we have to push as much as we can for the generations that come after us. So I think there's no bigger inspiration for me than the folks that came before me, obviously in my family and my community.
Thank you. What habits, good or bad, do you have in terms of something that keeps you focused and engaged and effective in what you do?
I mean, definitely I mental health is huge for me. So I recently got into meditation. And so there's this really great book that I would recommend for everyone. It's called The Book of Joy. And it's from two religious leaders, the Dalai Lama from Tibet, and the South African Archbishop. And they basically come together and talk about what are the barriers to joy, what makes you happy, and what is joy. And the book itself is fantastic in like self-discovery and understanding how humans operate. And, one of the key questions for the Dalai Lama, who is, one of the most peaceful guys ever, was, you were exiled from your own country by China, and you had nothing, you had no one, and you had to start fresh, and your community was slaughtered, and all these things happened. Like, how can you be so happy? And, it talks about how do you change your perspective. And so definitely a lot of mental health, meditation, self-care like that. Spending time outside, actually, I think is something that I recently started to appreciate at least once or twice a week, going for just a walk in nature, being in a park, reading out there, having just like quiet time with myself is really important. I think a lot of us don't do that, and it's actually very valuable. So none of this is particularly pricey or expensive, but it's still a form of self-care to slow down and sit with your thoughts for a while in a park. I mean, people hike. That's a thing. And I definitely try to go to the gym as much as I can, a couple of times a week, because having that actually gives you more energy and it makes you more productive and more focused. So a lot of self-care, which is actually fairly new for me in the past 2 or 3 years.
And that's something that many successful people always say they do. And, I think sometimes we feel very selfish about doing that self-care, like, oh, I could be doing 20 other things with that time. But I think what you mentioned in terms of reflection and having that time to yourself just makes you a better person, whether it's at home or at work.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and it helps elevate your mood, it helps you be more productive, it helps you just take time to yourself. And in general, a lot of us, we have a lot of responsibilities. We have the world on our shoulders. Sometimes it feels like of the burden of, like I said, pushing our community forward and pushing our families forward, or whatever issue you care about. And I think it's hard to take that time for yourself. And so I think that's really, really important. And it's definitely something new for me. I definitely grew up on the work all the time and make sure every minute is productive and don't sleep past a certain time. And I think I had to learn a lot of self-compassion, I guess. And understanding that it's okay to take that time. Every so often. I mean, it's something as just having the morning, like before you pick up your phone and going outside and doing a walk around the park before everyone's out and about and everything's crazy, having like a cup of warm tea and listen like a song or music that you like, that by itself will start your day off completely different and will allow you to just like center before going.
Last question. What's your next play? What are you doing, whether, professionally or personally, that's in the horizon for you?
I definitely think I'm going to stay in investment for a while. I have considered going back to school to get my MBA, which is probably a possibility within the next 2 or 3 years, but I think it depends kind of how I see it, just taking time off without money. It's like 2 years of no income. But yeah, no, I'm not sure. I mean, I think in general, I'm really excited about investing and helping smart people and hardworking people. And whether I can't invest in them directly, I love to just meet them and understand how I can be helpful. I'm like huge on just human capital, human potential. So I don't know, I'll probably do something long-term, I imagine, whether it's starting my own fund or starting my own company. At some point, I hope I can do my extra addition to our community.
Thank you. Well, you're doing a lot right now and with the focus of your company, and you're doing a lot by sharing so much time with me. So thank you so much for, first of all, taking, a year ago or 2 years ago, the cold email from me. And just for the insights that you share with us. I look forward to continuing to follow your path, your journey,
of course.
We'll have you at some point in the future so we can talk about, VCs, and hopefully at that time we'll have more than 28.
I hope so too. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Gracias. Hasta pronto.
I hope you enjoyed learning about Maria's journey. And now we're getting to our keyword or term of the episode. During our conversation, she defined unicorn, so make sure that you go back and review the definition. She also described what Y Combinator does. So I'm going to focus on defining a couple of other words that were mentioned but not fully defined during the interview, such as bootstrapped and pre-seed funding. So the first is bootstrapped, and according to cvinsights.com, it is defined as starting a business with money and resources from the founder's own pockets. This could be a barrier for some Latinx that do not have enough funding at the beginning to launch their own venture. So this is why VCs like Unshackled Ventures are important, because they provide an early round of financing, which is called pre-seed funding. And during this pre-seed funding, the founders can achieve specific milestones, possibly involved with having the right team, maybe recruiting like a key team member, and making sure that there's a product and market fit. So this will help get the company ready for the next round of funding, which tends to be bigger. So I hope you're enjoying learning not only about the personal and professional journeys of our guests, but also about some of the keywords that are used when investors and entrepreneurs are connecting with each other. As a reminder, please don't forget to leave a review for us on iTunes or whatever platform you use to listen to this podcast, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Latinx America and on Twitter at America Latinx, or email any questions or ideas to latinxamerica@gmail.com. Gracias y hasta la próxima semana.